Hello everyone, it is Joe here from Omnipoke, the channel that brings you guys everything Pokemon. If you're looking for PTCGO codes, including the stuff from Chilling Reign, make sure you go ahead and check out the Potown store. You can get a 5% discount on your order using that code Omnipoke. So today we are finishing off our set review. We have already gone over the V and VMAX cards, as well as all of the important trainers. So today we are looking at the one prize Pokemon, the non-rule boxes of Chilling Reign. There are a couple highlights here, but typically, as you know, one prizes are some of the least loved cards in the game. So there will also be a few flops in here.
And as per usual, we have our rating system back. You can also see we have the community ratings in the top right as well, so you can pause here to see our rating system and make sure you keep an eye out for what the community think of these cards. But yeah, enough talk. Let's jump straight in with Abomasnow. Abomasnow is a 140 HP grass type with the toughness boost ability. Your single strike Pokemon in play, except any Abomasnow, get plus 50 HP. You can't apply more than one toughness boost ability at a time. So essentially, this is an additional Cape of Toughness, quote unquote, for your single strike Pokemon. It's a decent ability. It's going to buff your single strikes up, make them a little bit more tanky, which is great. But in all fairness, we have certain Pokemon. We're kind of moving into a format where we have enough attackers that the 50 HP buff won't be particularly relevant. We already have Cape of Toughness that can be applied to any Pokemon to give it a HP buff that sees very, very niche play. This is way more specific, and it's a stage 1. That's just not worth the bench spot when it could be something like a Houndoom, which is going to accelerate energy and push towards your win condition. Typically, these single strike decks aren't looking to be defensive, they're looking to be quite aggressive. So Abomasnow, whilst helping with things like the Volcanion, as well as the Scroll of Scorn, I believe it is called, from the Battle Style set, do a bit more damage. It's just not worth the bench space compared to something like a Houndoom.
Onto another single striker, we have Beedrill. This is a stage 2 that allows you, with that Persist Sting, the sort of main focal point of this card, if your opponent's active has any special energy attached, it is knocked out. Now, we do know that special energy are heavily played right now in the format, and that seems to be going ahead and continuing into the new set. But there are still a number of archetypes where this isn't going to be relevant. Things like ADP, things like Shadow Rider potentially can play no special energy. Even Eternatus now with Moltres may go to like no special energy again. So already jamming in a stage 2 or trying a mustard package because it's a single striker just for this sort of in air quotes payoff will just whiff in a lot of situations based on matchups. And even then, if your opponent sees a Weedle on the board, they can start thinking ahead and playing around that for their main attacking Pokemon. It's so much work. There's no deck that can really afford to play like a thin line of a stage 2 in the modern era of Pokemon, so there's not enough payoff here.
Next up, we have Cinderace, another single striker, one that's a little bit more promising than the first two. 170 HP, stage 2, already stage 2, a bit worrying, but the Crisis Power ability says this Pokemon's attacks do 30 more damage for your opponent's active Pokemon for each prize card your opponent has taken. So basically, this is very similar to Karen's Conviction, and we've seen that this kind of effect can be pretty devastating. It can get out of hand quite quickly, which is crazy. Obviously, you're not really going to be able to build around this too well because the attack Fireball shot doing 150 for 2 isn't really going to be applying too much pressure early on. But the one situation we can foresee this card seeing play is as a finisher in the single prize Cinderace Libero deck, which typically tries to just rush in between a couple of Cinderaces, doing that 190 with Flare Striker turn after turn, kind of using a Cincino engine, trying to be completely rule box free. Maybe even now you can play like a Path to the Peak to try and disrupt the opponent a little bit. And then in the late game, you can take those last 3 prizes with Fireball Shot doing getting a buff from Crisis Power and Karen's Conviction. You can see down at the bottom, a maxed out Karen's Conviction plus Crisis Power means that you do 400 damage, which it actually knocks out any Pokemon in the format almost regardless of any buff. So you can legitimately see this as a game ender for the deck, which is pretty good. Obviously, even without having that maxed out sort of damage, even if they still have 2 prizes remaining, you can get up to 270 for tag teams or 350, which will KO VMAXs. So as a one-of in what looks to be quite a niche archetype, we have decided to give this the 2 treatment just because the raw damage output on this Pokemon is pretty insane, and it means that you don't have to look for things like Boss to try and close the game out with Flare Strikers on things like Crobats and Dedennes. Instead, you can just hopefully combine a Cinderace with a Crisis Power and maybe even a Karen's Conviction to just take out whatever's in the active. It's not going to be groundbreaking. Cinderace hasn't seen much success outside of very, very niche tournament success here and there, but it's a nice finisher for a deck that is probably honestly one of the better single prize archetypes out there right now.
Onto the water types, we start with Froslass. It's a 90 hit point stage 1, always nice for level ball, of course, and it has the ability Frost Over. When you play this Pokemon from your hand to evolve one of your Pokemon during this turn, you may attach a water energy from your discard pile to one of your Pokemon. We've actually seen this effect before on Abomasnow. The card obviously saw no play. Feels like Froslass is going to be a very similar boat. If you are playing a water accelerating deck that wants to play level ball, Frostmoth is going to be a bread and butter answer, I think. Typically, you just get way more value out of a Moth because you get multiple uses just from getting one stage 1 into play, whereas this Froslass will inevitably make you have to use multiple. Now, there is some argument potentially to have Froslass in a small package in addition to Melanie for like the Ice Rider or the potentially Inteleon VMAX based decks, because it allows you to basically use off turns where you're not using Melanie and still getting value. For example, you could boss Max Lance with a Froslass all in one turn from a 0 energy Calyrex, which is something you can't do with a Melanie package right now. So there is that small incentive where you can have some real big power spikes essentially. Or, you know, like if you miss attachments here and there, Froslass plus Melanie can help you catch up. But ultimately, you're not really safeguarding around those sorts of things from happening by jamming extra Clunk into your deck in the first place. So either go the Frostmoth route or go full on Melanie. Froslass is that awkward middle child that isn't really doing enough right now.
Next up, we have Inteleon. This is a Rapid Strike Stage 2 that we've mentioned in a couple of the videos so far. Fantastic ability, quick shooting. Once during your turn, you may put 2 damage counters on one of your opponent's Pokemon. So that's obviously the same as Feather Arrow. Feather Arrow on Decidueye was incredible. Decidueye was a very, very strong card in its time. Obviously, we're in a bit of a different format, but quick shooting in general is still a pretty strong ability, especially when something like an Ice Rider just quite misses the mark on tag teams. This is going to push it into a perfect range for knocking out some of these tag team Pokemon. Similarly with Inteleon, with a max bullet and a quick shooting, you can knock out something like a Crobat, whilst also setting up something on the bench. So this 2 damage counters may seem fairly inconsequential, but here and there they are going to push the numbers, especially across 1 or 2 turns, to the point where you're going to be able to take extra knockouts, which is great. Also has the Waterfall attack for 2 energy, which again, with things like Altaria going around, it is worth noting that it is at least a usable attack. One of the best things about Inteleon, though, is just the fact that it has it is an Inteleon. It has the Drizzile sort of Shady Dealings consistency package, as well as the Inteleon Shady Dealings to help out at the top end, as well as Sobble. Sobble has a Keep Calling attack, which lets you search for 3 basic Rapid Strike Pokemon, so you can search for a couple more Sobbles and hopefully be able to get a Shady Dealings Drizzile chain going to maybe try and get into something on a latter turn if you haven't been able to necessarily find what you need in the early turns. Just this line in general seems to be a lot better when the payoff isn't just done and dealt with as soon as you've played Shady Dealings. Now that we can play quick shooting and have kind of passive payoff across a couple of turns, it makes this Drizzile engine seem all the more appealing. Also, given the fact that we have Path to Peak in format now, we're going to look more towards this Path to Peak engine having an engine that doesn't get hindered by Path to Peak, and maybe even plays Path to Peak at the same time. So you can see that Inteleon, just by being an Inteleon and having access to Drizzile and the Sword and Shield Inteleon, it can really, really help just the card in general. You can grab things like the Buckets, the Sights, the Melanies, the more awkward cards that maybe you wouldn't run in high numbers, or the cards that you need on specific turns like the Melanie, to be able to keep the deck kind of churning through. Unfortunately, the one thing we will say is we've dropped it down to a 3 just because it is still a stage 2, and things like Cincino and even Jirachi may still just be better engines to counter Path to the Peak. Because the whole engine revolves around getting into your stage 1 and stage 2, it can be very, very consistent, but equally, we've seen how well Jirachi does in a scoop up net meta. We've seen how well even Cincino can do And it looks to be that these two cards, these two engines, are still going to be fantastic with Path to the Peak. There's no reason they won't be. So we're just not convinced that Inteleon is the best way to play any of these decks. It's been great in testing, especially in Ice Rider. We've actually really been impressed with how Ice Rider Inteleon has run, but there's no guarantees that it's the best way to play it. And because of that, it kind of lives and dies with whether this Drizzile Inteleon engine works or whether it's just better to play things like Cincino or Jirachi. So yeah, this card kind of lives and dies with that. But if it turns out that that package is really good, these extra couple of counters here and there across a couple of turns will push your 2-shots into 1-shots and really will mean that you can take prizes mid-turn and things like that, and can really change the tide of the game kind of on a whim, which is really good to see in some of these decks that normally would fall ever so slightly short on the damage output side of things.
Onto some psychic types, we have a single striker in Banette. It's a stage 1 again that can be levelable searchable because it only has 80 hit points, and it has the Resolute Spite attack, very similar to the old Froslass that has the Spiteful Sigh attack. This time we're doing 20 times the number of damage counters you put on yourself, up to 7, so your maximum damage output is 140 damage. Not looking too great, 140. Even hitting for weakness won't deal with an Urshifu VMAX, so really you're only targeting things like Mewtwo and the Rapid Strike V before it even evolves. A few other things here and there, of course, but the issue is these Psychic Pokemon, right now at least, can easily cover their Psychic weakness and often are playing Jirachi GX already. So Banette is going to be this like annoying tech stage 1 where you're already having to play level ball and shoehorn all this other stuff in, and even then it doesn't even serve the purpose that you want it to. So yeah, pretty bad card. Just worth the note because I know Froslass actually saw a little bit of fringe play in very early metas when Reshizard was first released. It feels like Banette isn't really fulfilling that same role though.
Next up, we have Cresselia. Cresselia is a very exciting card, pretty much a spiritual psychic reprint of Volcanion from Unbroken Bonds, with some very minor but I think notable differences. 120 HP psychic type with the Crescent Glow attack. Search your deck for a psychic energy and attach to one of your Pokemon. If you go second and it's your first turn, instead search for up to 3 psychic energy and attach them to one of your Pokemon. So slightly different to Flare Starter. All 3 of the psychic energy have to go to one Pokemon. This is worse than Flare Starter just because you don't have the versatility of being able to set up multiple attackers, and because of that, you have to attach to one Pokemon. If that Pokemon gets Gust KO'd, you're going to lose 3 energy, whereas you could kind of spread the energy out with Flare Starter. That by no means means it's a bad card, though. It's a fantastic attack still. Going to mean that you can set up your Mewtwo's or your other tag teams to be able to start using some of these really strong attacks from turn 2, or even just setting up your Calyrexes to be able to start churning out Max Geists for scary damage from turn 2 as well. So by no means a bad attack, just definitely marginally worse than Flare Starter. And similarly, Photon Laser is also marginally worse. It does 30 damage plus 90 more if you have at least 5 energy in play, whereas Volcanion needed at least 4 energy in play. So it's, again, very marginally worse than Volcanion, almost inconsequential, because a Crescent Glow on turn 2, or on turn 1, if you're going second, plus 2 manual attachments on turn 1 and 2 mean that you still get the buff for Photon Laser. But again, just worth noting, it isn't quite as good as Volcanion. That being said, still a fantastic attacker. We have Fog Crystal to be able to tutor this. Easier than basically Volcanion ever could have been tutored, because we can play Fog Crystal plus Quick Ball if needs be. So you're always going to have outs to Cresselia to be able to build up your Shadow Riders, like I say, even to be able to build up your Mewtwo and Mews, or your Gengar Mimikyus, or your Trevnoirs. This card also pushes sort of Green's Trevnoir itself. This plus Path to the Peak plus Fog Crystal mean that we can actually consistently get a turn 2 Night Watch plus Ability Lock now, which is pretty scary. The Green's engine will be leaving us pretty shortly, but there are enough tools, we feel, in this set for there to be an argument to try out a Green's engine. And Cresselia is kind of the backbone, similar to how Volcanion was the backbone to Greenzard. Cresselia does that perfectly for Trevnoir. So yeah, we've seen how good Volcanion is. It's been a fantastic card. It's been a one-of in many different iterations of Fire decks. It's still played here and there now. So yeah, just a fantastic card. One other minor thing to note, though, is obviously Calyrex wants to be attaching a lot of Psychic Energy from hand to be able to draw cards. With Volcanion, that wouldn't normally be an issue, just because we still have things like Giant Hearth to be able to access these Fire Energy after we've tutored 3 out. With Flare Starter, Cresselia doesn't have access to any of that. It does have Fog Crystal, but the Fog Crystals early game are going to be used on getting benched Pokemon out, so it will be a little bit harder to find Psychic Energy after you have got a Crescent Glow off if you're going second, but that payoff is kind of still worth it because you're still going to be able to use Night Watch out of nowhere, you're still going to be able to use Poltergeist, Horror House, even just a Max Geist. So yeah, a fantastic card. We've seen Volcanian's success through its couple of years in Standard, and there's no reason to believe this won't be similar. The only reason we haven't pushed this all the way to 5 stars is just because Horror House is such a cheesy GX attack that can just win games on turn 2. And there will be kind of that mental game you have to play every time you go second as a Shadow Rider player as to whether you want to go for the Crescent Glow and maybe play for the long game, or whether you want to try and cheese out the opponent with a Horror House GX. It's going to be board dependent, it's going to be matchup dependent, it's going to be which of these cards you can access. We can foresee maybe playing one of each in some Shadow Rider variants just to have access to both options. But because this isn't a guaranteed turn 1 attack, there will be situations where Horror House is the correct play. We can't quite bump it up to a 5-star, though it is very, very close to being a 5-star just because it sets up some fantastic attacks within the deck.
Onto an interesting pair of the stage 2s here, Gardevoir and Gallade, some of the previously most beloved cards, and we have a lot of text here to go through. The Gardevoir is a Psychic type, 140 hit point, stage 2, has the Shining Arcana ability. Once during a turn, you may look at the top 2 cards of your deck and attach any number of basic energy cards you find there to your Pokemon in any way that you like, and put the other cards into your hand. This is of course stackable as well, so straight away we are going to try and get as many Guardies into play as possible, and try and A, draw a bunch of cards, and B, get acceleration for free all the time. This is, although, it is a stage 2, it's a cheating stage 2, just like we have seen Greninja in the past, because Kirlia has water duplicates. This time it's called Mirage Step, but it's the same thing, where you can go ahead, use a 1 attachment to go ahead and search your deck for 3 Kirlias and put them directly to the bench. So the hope is that after a Mirage Step, you can try and spam the board of Guardies. Once you got 1 into play, you're using that Shining Arcana to draw into hopefully more pieces that get more Guardies rumbling, and then hopefully you're getting multiple accelerators and multiple card draw cards all at your disposal. The issue is, what are you actually attacking with? Brainwave does 60 base plus 30 more for each Psychic Energy attached to this Pokemon, so it's an expensive attack cost, and you're only really getting into that 2-shot range unless you're really starting to commit quite heavily to 1 Gardevoir, which, let's face it, is getting immediately knocked out because it only has 140 hit points. So it's slow setup because you're spending, turn 2 doing no damage with Kirlia, turn 3 could end up being only 150 damage or something like that, and you're having to continually replenish that damage as well with a chain of Shining Arcanas, which isn't always the easiest thing to pull off. Gallade can be a bit of respite here and there thanks to that Dynablade attack. For 2 colorless, you do 60 times each of your opponent's V Pokemon in play, and it's a fighting type, so straight away you can breathe a sigh of relief in the Eternatus matchup. You should be pretty favorable in that matchup, even with the slower turns that you are having with the Curliers and whatnot, because Gallade can help you pull through. And in general matchups, that fighting type coverage means you could be doing some aggressive boss plays. Gardevoir draws you enough cards that you sometimes can piece together these sorts of options and have the opportunity to still use boss's orders. So that's an interesting prospect. The psychic typing of Guardi as well means that you are dangerous at least into the Urshifu matchup and into Mewtwo matchups, I should say. So that's a couple things going for you. At the same time, you have things like Crest that could be that early game accelerator that Jack just mentioned. You can use Primate Wisdom with Guru to improve your Shining Arcana to at least guarantee energy attachments, which is nice. Fog Crystal helps your early game for getting Raltses into play, as well as getting you that energy turn 2 for Mirage Step. So we can naturally play Fog Crystal at a high count, Level Ball at a high count, and hopefully give yourself good consistency for that turn 2 Curlier. The only thing I'm mostly concerned about here is A, you're very slow tempo-wise, and against things like ADP, that just means you're dead immediately. And some other decks, especially if they can also try and play that 1 or 2 prize game with you a little bit, or undo some of the damage that you've been doing with Brainwave, they're going to out-tempo you quite a lot. And also, the archetype has a lot of reason to fizzle a lot of the time. Even if you are maxing out with 4 copies of Gardevoir, if you're not getting 2 or 3 of those into play immediately, you're even with the abilities that you are getting, you're not drawing enough cards to sort of reload and maintain enough Gardevoirs throughout the entire game. A lot of people will probably still experiment with this. That's why we gave it the 2-star rating, and that's kind of reflected in the community review, because people are mostly leaning towards this being 2 and 3-star archetypes, because they've seen dupes in the past, they've seen the ability that draws cards, there's a lot of morsels here to enjoy, and there's a couple good type coverages. We think it's not well-rounded enough to become, you know, a flourishing archetype in the metagame, but we do see enough that we're going to see it on the tables here and there.
Next up, we have Malamar, a Rapid Strike, one prize Pokemon, Psychic type with 120 HP. Has the Rapid Strike Tentacles attack for 1 energy, does 40 damage, and you reveal any number of Rapid Strike cards from your hand. It does 40 damage for each card revealed, then you shuffle those back into the deck. So obviously there's a plethora of different Rapid Strike cards you can play. This is very reminiscent to something like a Mr. Rhyme with the ball, sort of the ball juggling attack, or maybe a Blacephalon. It's kind of that style of build a big hand, try and take a big KO, and then spend a couple of turns trying to build a big hand again. The thing is, with this, one, it's a stage 1, so immediately Blown kind of outclasses it just because that's a basic. We've evidently seen that the Ball Guy deck didn't really go very well, and that was able to use its damage output was based on consistency. Well, there is certain consistency pieces here, things like Brawly and Karina's Focus, as well as an auxiliary engine to be able to search out this damage is pretty cool, but ultimately it's really not going to get you anywhere. We're going to have to use supplementary draw, things like Oricorio, maybe even Lucky Eggs, to try and draw more cards, draw into more Rapid Strike cards to be able to then take knockouts. The typing is great, to be honest. You're not going to need too many Rapid Strike cards to be able to deal with Urshifus. But outside of that, single prize decks just don't fare well against things like ADP. Similarly, things like Eternatus and Calyrex are not going to need to put too much effort into their board to be able to just consistently churn through Malamars, and you're really going to struggle to sometimes even two-shot them. So yeah, it's definitely kind of a flashy attack, and we've seen many of these different archetypes do well, but the only see printing before, but the only one that's ever done well has been Blown, and that's, I think, primarily just because it had such a good engine behind it, whereas the Rapid Strike, getting Rapid Strike cards into the hand engine really just isn't consistent enough for this to ever be doing relevant numbers outside of weakness on something like an Urshifu and a Mewtwo. And we've said in the past how these decks are already playing Jirachi just to deal with the fact that they have psychic weakness, so even in those matchups, you're going to be in a pretty rough spot.
On to Slurpuff. This is really only an honourable mention with the eye on rotation, because Follow the Scent could be the predecessor to Excadrill, really just one to keep note of. It's far, far worse than Rototiller because you're flipping coins and you require Twin Energy, so it may be that Control goes back to the drawing board post-rotation, but I know that some people do try and keep an eye on these things, so I thought I'd give it the mention here, but ultimately in Standard, it's basically going to have 0 impact.
Next up, we have Lycanroc. Lycanroc is kind of similar to Vespiquen of the past. It has the Rogue Fangs attack. For 2 fighting energy, it does 80 damage, plus 10 more for each single strike Pokemon in the discard pile. So very similar to Bee Revenge, however, Bee Revenge was any number of Pokemon. We do have a fair few single strike Pokemon in all fairness, as well as this damage immediately having a plus 60 modifier, plus being able to be modified with single strike energy. So this can get into some pretty scary damage ranges, but it's just nowhere near as easy to get all of these Pokemon into the discard in the first instance. It's also a stage 1, whereas we have a lot of really strong single prize, basic single strike Pokemon. And finally, we're also in a format where even with the plus 60 modifier and maybe even 1 or 2 single strike energy, this still isn't going to be one-shotting anything. In Vespiquen's era, there was certain situations towards the late game where you could eventually reach the one-shot range with this. Obviously, you are going to be able to one-shot things like Crobats and Dedenes, but you're never, ever, ever going to be able to one-shot a VMAX like this. Whereas Vespiquen was able to go toe-to-toe in the late game with some of these 180 HP EX Pokemon. So, unfortunately, this damage hasn't quite scaled as much as the HPs have, and we have a lot of other very, very good basic single strike Pokemon that just kind of mean the Rogue Fangs attack isn't quite as flashy as it once was, even with all the damage modification that it's received in its reprint.
onto Passimian, possibly the most powerful one prizer we're going to talk about today. It's a very simple card. It's going to be a bench-sitting buff card. Thanks to that ability, Throwing Coach, your Rapid Strike Pokemon's attacks do 30 more damage to your opponent's benched Pokemon V and benched Pokemon GX. You can't apply more than one Throwing Coach ability at a time. So they've literally taken the telescopic sight text and thrown it onto an ability, which means we can stack these two on top of each other and become a real threat for some of our favorites already in the format. Rapid Strike Urshifu going from 120 to 2 different targets up to potentially 180 on 2 targets with the combo of the tool plus 1 Passimian in play just becomes very, very dangerous. You can now target Crobats, Dedennes, Eldegoss, Oricorio, and even try and set up, Gale Thrust into pushing them to the bench and then using Telescopic Throwing Coach to finish off things as well, even VMAXs. That was one of the downsides of Urshifu, is that we had to play things like Dojo and sometimes even be behind on prizes to two-shot opposing VMAX Pokemon. Now we can try and go about it by pushing them to the bench and targeting other things here. So it allows Urshi to be far more aggressive and maybe even try and add in Echoing Horn to really capitalize on making the most out of a Rapid Flow turn. And it means you have better two-shot ability into VMAX matchups with Urshifu, which is already one of the best sort of decks that we have available. So it will only ever really see a 1 to 2 count if you feel it's important enough in decks, but it really revitalizes how Urshifu will be played in the future. There's also the sort of backdoor option of Zeraora variants being viable. We've spoken about Blaziken builds trying to accelerate Zeraora. There's also the possibility that Zeraora makes it into Urshifu if they're playing basic Lightning Energies and Coco Prism Star for a small time, to try and burst that Crossed Fist into 220 realms, which is extremely dangerous into evolving V Pokemon, not just the bench sitter ability type Pokemon as well. So yeah, really excellent card. It also can actually attack as well with Fling. You do 1 for 20, and typically you probably will play at least Rapid Strike Energy, but also some basic fightings could easily make it into the deck. So Passimian could be just somewhat of a setup merchant if you are just short on damage, or if you want to skew that prize race and have something to do on a turn. Fling could be an option as well, but mostly he's going to chill. He's going to feel like a Diancie Prism Star, that sort of effect where it's giving you such a big buff just by putting it into play as a basic. Such easy and strong value. Really, really strong card.
Next up we have Galarian Runerigus with the Spiteful Slate ability. If this Pokemon's in the active spot and is damaged by an attack from your opponent's opponent's Pokemon VMAX, even if it's knocked out, put damage counters on the attacking Pokemon equal to the damage done to this Pokemon. Obviously, nothing too flashy, very similar to the Perish body in kind of punishing attacking into this one prizer. Obviously, this is guaranteed damage, whereas Cursola is a coin flip, but this means that kind of any overextension into a Galarian Runerigus can be quite punishing, which is cool. We don't have too many hit and switch style decks right now. There are obviously some fantastic hit and switch Pokemon in the format, but typically these decks aren't doing very well. But it could just become a bit of a wall, a bit like an Altaria or something, just to try and slow the opponent down. Maybe you've poked them or something, and a Spiteful Slate would knock them out. Obviously, the thing is, you can really play around this. The second you see a Yamask, you can start to think, okay, can I attack with my V Pokemon and therefore mitigate the ability completely? If not, am I able to do 120 damage and not take any extra damage? And, we can't see a home for this really anywhere in any relevant deck right now. We can't see any archetypes coming forward that are going to want this kind of effect. And the fact that you can just play around it means that it's not that strong of an effect in general. Cursola potentially knocks them out, and I think is actually in most aspects a little bit scarier than just doing some guaranteed damage counters in these style of decks. So yeah, Runerigus has a very flashy ability, but unfortunately one that is not really fitting anywhere in the format right now.
Onto the dark types, and we have a pair that go along with each other, the Galarian and regular Weezing here. Obviously both stage 1s, both dark types sharing 130 hit points each. The Galarian Weezing has the ability Energy Factory. Each basic dark energy attached to your Pokemon that have Weezing in their name provides 2 dark energy instead, and this is a non-stackable, only 1 Energy Factory, can be online at any one time, and this is really trying to help out the regular Weezing that has the Smog Burst attack For Dark Colorless, you do 20, and 20 more for each Dark Energy attached to all of your Pokemon. So the idea is going to be get 4 Koffings out, get 1 Galarian Weezing and 1 regular Weezing into play, hopefully multiple regular Weezings, so that you can cash in on the factory on various different cards. Maybe some EXP share action coming in here as well. Galarian Moltres, a free attachment every turn. That's 20 damage gained every turn as well. You could try and sit behind a neutralizing Gas Weezing even, because you can Ascension straight into that guy and buy time and build a board sort of behind this. But typically, I think this is going to be too slow, and the damage ramp is just very, very slow. You will end up nowhere near the sort of realms you want to be, even with a full setup. And there's no draw involved in either of these cards. You're going to be constantly having to dig deeper into the deck with all sorts of different things. I dread to think how difficult it's going to be to maintain enough Koffing, Weezing, and Galar Weezing in play in any one game. It's going to be a bit of a mess, to be honest. So yeah, pretty low value deck in general.
We have Qwilfish, a really interesting Pokemon, single strike, 90 HP Dark type with the Bursting Needles ability. This Pokemon is in the active spot and is knocked out by damage from an opponent's attack. Put 6 damage counters on the attacking Pokemon. We've seen many abilities like this, and they really haven't done much in the past. But this is a fantastic pivot or thing to throw into the active in Eternatus, when typically, especially right now, you really don't need to use that energy acceleration, the power accelerator attack on the basic Eternatus. You can now just throw a Qwilfish into the active, and if nothing else, it makes them use a boss. It makes them not draw cards. It makes them have to dig a little bit deeper. This isn't going to be groundbreaking, but we think a one-of in Eternatus actually could be pretty influential. Forcing them to use boss on their second turn to be able to get around this is great. It means they're not continuing their setup, which is kind of fine, especially when it doesn't matter what they boss in most instances, because the Energy Switch Galarian Moltres package can now mean we can set up an Eternatus from nowhere, which is great. But similarly, if they can't boss and have to hit into this just to take that tempo prize, well, that's going to mean Dreadend almost certainly will be knocking out whatever they attacked into this with, because the combination of these, all of these damage counters together is 330, which is knocking out almost all of the VMAXs, with Scoop Up Nets and Galarian Zigzagoons if you decide to play those as well, which you might want to because you need to move the Qwilfish if it doesn't get knocked out. You're going to be into the 340 range, which is great. That's exactly where you need to be. So yeah, not a very flashy card, but as a one-off in Eternatus, it feels like it really could change the kind of prize route that a lot of decks take against Eternatus, which could be really influential in terms of taking those extra prizes and pushing into being able to get a knockout early game with the Dread End attack that normally you may miss if you're just doing 270.
Onto Seviper, one of my favorite packages that I'm certainly going to be trying from the single strike route these days, because it's a dark type, which immediately opens the door for you to have a couple interesting type coverages in the one prize category now. Based around, heavy Houndoom, you're going to try and work towards the strong tail attack for 2 dark and a colorless. Of course, single strike energy does fulfill the dark cost. And we also have the new impact energy as well for the single strike that you can manually attach, which acts as a rainbow, so it can be treated as a fighting or a dark in this case. You do 90 vanilla, but if you played a single strike supporter from your hand during this turn, you do an additional 90 damage. 180 isn't inspiring, especially when you can't be using a boss. You'll have to be using Bruno or Karen instead. There is, of course, still Great Catcher available to you for exactly Dedenne, but I feel like the push of the single strike energies really make this more dangerous. 180 already is decent into VMAXs, of course, for two-shotting purposes, but you can even knock out regular V Pokemon if you've been able to, get 2 single strike energies into play, either by attaching manually or using Houndooms themselves. And you, of course, have that great weakness that you can boast into hitting Trevnoir, Gengar, as well as, of course, Shadow Rider. So that's really exciting for me. I also feel like late game, this becomes the beat stick, and again, that payoff. The Karen's Conviction starts to come into her own and become extremely powerful when she can buff 80 damage or buff 100 damage in the very, very late stages. That means that either the Seviper or the Stunjourner could get into really dangerous realms. I feel like you just go almost completely one prize with this build, go very heavy on the single strike package, have those welcoming lanterns, meaning that you can Karen as and when you want it in the late game. You're going to be using those urns to reload your single strike energies. It will require a decent amount of setup, of course. You will have to get multiple Houndours into play, and that's always going to be your ongoing challenge. The good news is both Seviper and Stonejourner and even Urshifu V all have one colorless in their attack cost, so you can play some capture energies, as well as quick balls and comms and that sort of thing, and try and build almost like a new age Malamar, really, where you're playing tons of one prize Pokemon, trying to hit high damage output. A little bit on the inconsistent side, which is why we're not bumping it any higher, but there's definitely some potential here.
Next up, we have Spiritomb. Spiritomb has the Ghostly Cries attack. If each Pokemon in your opponent's discard pile, put 1 damage counter on your opponent's Pokemon in any way you like. If you place any damage counters in this way, your opponent shuffles all Pokemon from their discard pile into their deck. You can see that this is absolutely going to cripple Mad Party, which is quite funny. It's going to reset their damage output as well as possibly take 2, even 3, maybe even 4 prizes in certain situations because of how low HP some of these Mad Parties have. The thing is, though, kind of only affects Mad Party, and Mad Party already looks like it's going to be gatekept by Calyrex anyway. So because of that, Spiritomb actually comes out at a time where it's really not needed because the deck that it counters isn't going to be very good anyway. It's worth noting that in Expanded, this is better than Oricorio and Karen combined because it is both of those cards in one. So in Expanded, it has fantastic uses, but in Standard, because of Calyrex having 2 great attacks against Mad Party already, it turns out that this Ghostly Cries attack is great in the matchup, but you're never really going to be seeing this matchup anymore anyway. And because of that, it's down at the 1-star just because we have better options that happen to have come out just after this was revealed.
Onto the Castforms, a really fun ability that all 4 of these cards share. The Weather Reading ability says that if you have 8 or more Stadium cards in your discard pile, ignore all energy in this Pokemon's attack costs. So you effectively can hit for free. We've seen this previously with things like Rotom of the past. Of course, it's Mimi. Of course, it's probably on the awkward side. But basically, it means we can look at all of these attacks and expect them to be hitting, for free. And you could potentially play a deck that plays no energy whatsoever, which is a nice quirk here. But you will be panning out your deck instead of energy cards with a ton of stadiums, and it is going to be your goal to research these, dene these, use the effects of Viridian and Half to discard additional stadiums, even though you're putting some into play, and maybe even have things like Path of the Peak in your deck to disrupt other people as you're on your quest to get 8 in the discard pile. The real upsides here is that you can do 150 damage with the Sunny form, and of course you are fire-type coverage, which can be beneficial into some Zacian players. There's the Snowy form that can Frosty Typhoon for 120 as well. These are both quite poor damage output overall. The other 2 are even worse, like the Rainy form is a spread approach, and the regular colorless cast form is 80, and you get to draw until you have 6 in hand. Maybe you play 1 or 2 of these just for the early game, as you're going crazy on dump and draw, and maybe even using things like Articuno, you could go lower in that hand size and then Weather Force your way back up potentially as an end game sort of play, an end turn sort of play, I should say. There's also the opportunity to play Fighting Energy among all of these options and have Dojo in here to try and push this very mediocre damage output. You all know it's Mimi. You all know you're going to whiff those 8 stadiums. And if you do, you literally just pass with these 1 prizes and have no backup play. You're only hitting a couple type coverages, and even then, they're not the most relevant. A lot of these archetypes can play around that, especially the damage output that they're both aiming for. The Snowy form's not even one-shotting the Fire VMAXs, so they're not particularly scared anyway. And yeah, ADP can go Zacianless, and then the high pressure blast is very low pressure in the end. So yeah, pretty Mimi, pretty fun, but there they are.
Next up, we have Greedent. Greedent was a very hyped card when it was first revealed, kind of in the wake of Crushing Hammer getting on people's nerves. The Brazen Tail ability says energy attached to your Pokemon can't be put into your hand, deck, or discard pile by any effect of your opponent's item or supporter cards. So things like Crushing Hammer and Yell Grunt won't be able to disrupt your energy. We've seen that has been kind of the bane of a lot of people's existence over the past 6 to 12 months because of the nature of the format where every energy counts, and most of these 2 energy attacks on turn 2 make or break the game. So you can see why people were quite excited about this card. The thing is, it's a stage 1 in a format where we don't have Ditto Prism, which means you have to be playing, you have to be dedicating at least 2 slots, realistically probably 4 slots, to a 2-2 Greedent line just to be able to consistently get it out. And that's 4 cards that aren't draw cards, that aren't consistency cards. I've just mentioned how important it is to get that turn 2 attack off in almost every single matchup. And Greedent is not going to help that. It's a defensive card. It's going to mean that your opponent can't stop that themselves. But if your deck can't do that in the first place, it doesn't matter if they hit the Crushing Hammerheads if you're not consistent enough to attack anyway. So it's a very flashy card, and it cheered a lot of people up when it was first revealed. But I think the card was massively overhyped. It's not worth the stage 1 investment into the Pokemon itself. And unfortunately, we're just going to have to deal with Crushing Hammers and that kind of thing existing for a little while longer, because Greedent is not worth putting into your deck just to try and mitigate the effect of some of these cards.
Onto Kecleon. It's an interesting Rapid Strike Pokemon that has the ability Chroma Shift. This Pokemon is the same type as any basic energy attached to it. If it has 2 or more different types of basic energy attached, this Pokemon is each of those types. And it has the Spinning Attack, which is just a vanilla 90 damage for 3 colorless. Now, we can try and reduce this attack cost by playing Twin Energy and Rapid Strike Energy, but you still need to play those basic energy cards to try and take advantage of hitting all sorts of different things for weakness. The way we can try and maximize this sort of damage output is by having the Uxie package in here, where you put an Uxie, Azelf, and Mesprit into play, and you change every Pokemon's weakness to ×4 rather than ×2. So that 90 goes from 180 to 360, which you love to see. Huge, big burst tempo from a Kecleon, of all things. The problem here is pretty obvious. Firstly, you need to get your board full of these sort of bench-sitting Pokemon without the draw power of Dedennes or Jirachis or anything like that, or at least you'll have to scoop up net those sorts of cards. You're going to have to maintain 3 energies in play the entire time on Pokemon that will easily just get one-shots, so not only do you have to play the Twin Energies, the Rapid Strike Energies, you'll also probably have to play EXP Share, and if at any point those are taken away, or if you get Crushing Hammered, you basically instantly lose, and you're going to be divvying up a ton of your slots to various type coverages that you think are important in the format. There's a high variety of decks in the game right now, and probably like 10 or so cards, so you might have to play realistically like 1 of every type of energy in the game, and then like 2 of the most important ones, like the fighting, psychic, dark sort of things, and really just cross your fingers and hope for the best that you can pinpoint these, get them out. They're not prized. You can Viridian into them. You can recover them with things like Ordinary Rod and then draw back into them. There's so many hurdles here. Again, it feels like a highlight reel card where you hit 360, someone immediately concedes because they can't respond on that Kecleon and they're just threatening a huge spinning attack the following turn. But it's a lot of setup. You don't have board space to make this consistent enough, and there's a ton of other hurdles involved as well.
Finally, we have Zangoose, another Rapid Strike Pokemon. With the Gale Claws attack for 3 energy, you do 50 damage. And if you play a Rapid Strike supporter from your hand during this turn, this attack does 50 damage to 2 of your opponent's benched Pokemon. So we've seen that they're really leaning into these bench-style attacks. We have Passimian Telescopic Sight to push this to 110. Obviously, 110 isn't great. It's not the huge amount of damage that some of the VMAXs can be pulling off, but it could close out the game, obviously, in combination with something like a Zeraora or an Urshifu. This could be a nice 1-prize attacker in those decks. The only real Rapid Strike supporter we can see consistently playing, though, is Karina's Focus. We have Brawly and Seabold as well, but both of those are pretty underwhelming, and in the mid to late game, they're really not doing too much for you. So Karina's Focus is kind of probably going to be the one you're going to be looking for, and because of that, like all of these different kind of slightly inconvenient things, it just means that basically there's no real reason to play this when we have such fantastic options with Zeraora and Rapid Strike Urshi. Yes, this is a nice 1-prize attacker in certain situations, but ultimately, outside of that, we're just going to be getting more payoff for things like a Zeraora or an Urshifu. And despite Passimian and Telescopic Sight really pushing this into being able to be a pretty strong output, 270 damage worth of output with all of the buffs for 3 energy on a 1-prize Pokemon is fantastic. Unfortunately, you need a lot to go right, and you need to use a very subpar supporter on your turn just to be able to get that extra damage. So yeah, not ideal, especially when we compare it to something like Zeraora or Rapid Strike Urshi, which just kind of do what it does, but better.
So that's it for the single prizes. I think obviously Passimian is like an immediate pickup if you are someone who likes to play Rapid Strike. Then there are some more speculative things in here. The Seviper, quite interesting if you are trying to build a single approach. Gardevoir Gallade, if you want that throwback to either Gardevoir Gallade themselves or Greninja, potentially. Cresselia, a really big card if you are looking to play either some Mewtwo variants or any Psychic variant, really could pick up at least like 1 to 2 copies. And there's the option of the Inteleon package. We're still on the fence, really, if we think it's stronger than just straight up Jirachi Net or Cincino. Both of these are sort of tried and trusted and have kept Inteleon out of the format so far as a package. But if you think quick shooting is enough of a payoff that it will trump these in the future format, those are also going to be worth picking up.
Definitely, and if you want some bling, these one prize Pokemon all got gold variants as well. Bronzong, Electrode, and Snorlax to dig for in these packs. When the set comes out this week, very exciting. Make sure you head down to your local game stores and support them in this time of need. Obviously, you can crack packs very shortly, which is going to be exciting. Make sure you share with us what you pull on opening day. We're always excited to see how people do with their boxes and stuff like that. So make sure you send us all your photos, tag us in on things like Twitter and stuff. And yeah, other than that, that's been the big 3-part Chilling Reign set review, all sorted. We're on the cusp of the set being released now, which is really exciting. We're going to be having lots of deck profiles, lots of streams, the usual stuff from us when a new set comes out. So make sure you stay tuned for all of that stuff. And yeah, other than that, thank you very much for watching. We've been Jack and Joe from Omnipoke, and we look forward to seeing you guys in another video in the future. Cheers, everyone.